Hello, this is Pastor Mahlon Smith, pastor here at New Hope Baptist Church in Watertown, New York, and I welcome you today to our video series where we are going through the Bible. We're going to be talking about the book of Ecclesiastes. Now, we have been looking at what are commonly referred to as the poetic books in these last couple of videos. We have thus far looked at Job, Psalm, and Proverbs. The book of Job has to do with God's wisdom in suffering. And so there's a lot of discussion in the book of Job pertaining to how it was that Job would respond in the face of suffering, as well as how God's purposes were clearly at work. And obviously God knew that Job was a man of integrity. He said as much. And therefore we see how Job exercised God's wisdom in the face of much suffering and anguish. Then we looked at the book of Psalms, and there we saw God's wisdom in our worship. Psalms is the worship hymn book of Israel. And so we see God's relationship with his people in terms of worship, and thus there we see wisdom in worship. Then the book of Proverbs, it deals with God's wisdom in life, dealing with all the various aspects of life, marriage and raising of children, as well as employment. And so we see there God's wisdom in terms of life. And this whole theme of wisdom pervades throughout the poetic books. And wisdom refers to exercising skill in godly living. Well, today we're going to talk about the book of Ecclesiastes. And if we were to define a theme for the book of Ecclesiastes, it would be how God defines true meaning, value, and purpose. Now, Solomon is the author of the book of Ecclesiastes, as well as the book of Proverbs. Now, in the next video, we will be looking at the Song of Solomon. And if we were to take Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon all together, Song of Solomon represents Solomon as he would have been in the earlier parts of his reign as the king of Israel. The book of Proverbs, we could say, pictures Solomon as he would have been perhaps in the middle of his reign, as he was giving instructions to his son. Well, the book of Ecclesiastes has Solomon looking back over the course of his life. And if you read the story of Solomon, you find out that Solomon had begun really as a good king. He loved the Lord, but then he lost his way. And he delved into all sorts of sin and all sorts of temptations. And as a result, he strayed far away from God. And the book of Ecclesiastes summarizes what Solomon found in his pursuits. If I were to read to you a verse that we could say is the theme verse of the book of Ecclesiastes, it would be this. Ecclesiastes 12:13. The conclusion, when all has been heard, is, fear God and keep his commandments, because this applies to every person. That's Ecclesiastes 12:13. So what Solomon is going to argue for in the book of Ecclesiastes is that God is the sum source of all meaning and value and purpose. Now, if we were to summarize and outline the book of Ecclesiastes, we could do it under three headings. First, God defines meaning, and we could assign chapters 1 to 4 under that heading. Then, God defines value in chapters 5 to 11, and then God defines purpose in chapter 12. Now, of course, there are many secular writers in the past 20th century as well as today who oftentimes try to find meaning, value, and purpose in anything but God. But of course, their pursuit ultimately ends up being quite fruitless. And as we're going to see here in the book of Ecclesiastes, trying to find meaning, value, or purpose outside of God is a fruitless endeavor. Just as an example of one writer, Albert Camus, he was a French philosopher. This is what he has to say, quote, "Man's exile is without remedy, since he is deprived of the memory of a lost home or the hope of a promised land. This divorce between man and his life, the actor and his setting, is properly defined as the feeling of absurdity," end quote. And that was Camus' entire philosophy. He concluded that life ultimately really didn't have any meaning. It was absurd. And that's the best that man can do apart from God. Now, as you look here in the book of Ecclesiastes, especially in the first 4 chapters, here we find that God defines true meaning. And as you go down through those 4 chapters, Solomon tells us that true meaning, it's not found in the natural realm, nor in humanism, nor in pleasure, nor in education, nor in hard work, nor in having more time, nor talent. None of those things will ultimately bring you to true meaning. Now, what do I mean by meaning? Meaning tells me what is ultimate and who I am. What is ultimate and who I am. That's how we could define meaning. So when we say that God is and defines true meaning, what we're saying is that God tells me what is ultimate. God tells me who I am. And that's what Solomon concludes in the first 4 chapters. What about value? Well, value tells me how I ought to live. So if meaning defines who I am, then value tells me how I ought to live. So when we say that God is and defines true meaning, He also defines what is valuable, what's really important, how I ought to live. And we see that, of course, in chapters 5 through 11. And then what about purpose? Well, purpose tells me the goal of life. So, meaning tells me what is ultimate and who I am. Value tells me how I ought to live. And purpose tells me the goal of life. So when we say that God defines meaning, value, and purpose, we're also saying that as we follow the Lord, as we love Him with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, we will discover the true purpose of life. And that is knowing God and living for God. True purpose is found in the Creator and not in the creation. Now, there are some wonderful verses here in the book of Ecclesiastes, and we could certainly point out many of them. For instance, in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 1, there is an appointed time for everything, and there is a time for everything under heaven. And certainly the book of Ecclesiastes, as it develops this theme of meaning, value, and purpose as being defined by God, it talks quite a bit about time. Or again, Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verse 1, guard your steps as you go to the house of God and draw near to listen, rather than to offer the sacrifice of fools, for they do not know they are doing evil. Do not be hasty in word or impulsive in thought to bring up a matter in the presence of God. For God is in heaven, and you are on earth. Therefore let your words be few. That's Ecclesiastes 5, 1-2. So, not only ought we to be careful in how we spend our time, but also in the words that we say. Because again, as we understand that God is the definition and the source of all meaning, value, and purpose, how we use our words can oftentimes affect our lives before Him. One of the phrases that you'll find repeated throughout the book of Ecclesiastes is the futility of life apart from God. Matter of fact, here in the beginning of Ecclesiastes, for example, Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 2, vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. One translation renders it meaningless, meaningless, says the preacher. All is meaningless. And so when you read the book of Ecclesiastes, it can come off as being quite pessimistic, negative. A lot of people sometimes when they read the book of Ecclesiastes, they say this almost sounds like an unbeliever is writing this book. It's as if here's a man who's tried everything out in life that there is to be tried, and he has found everything wanting. But you see, that's the point of the book of Ecclesiastes. Solomon has reflected back over the course of his life. Remember, he was the wealthiest man, the wisest man who ever lived, and he had tried everything there is to try. Fame, fortune, many, many relationships. He had 700 wives, 300 concubines. And yet, in all those pursuits, he kept concluding, it's all meaningless. Why? Because he tried to find meaning, value, and purpose apart from God. And so we understand then that the only one who can ultimately define meaning, value, and purpose is God himself. And so that's the book of Ecclesiastes, and I certainly commend it to you. As we close today in this video, let me once more read to you verse 13 of Ecclesiastes 12, because this verse not only gives us the theme verse for the book, but I think it captures what we're trying to talk about here. The conclusion, when all has been heard, is fear God and keep his commandments, because this applies to every person. May God richly bless you as you continue to go through this video series.